Welcome to Ketshi Gaming, and I'm Ketshi1383. This time around, I wanted to cover a game from a series that is near and dear to me. That being The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. Now I know this game has been out for months and I've probably long since missed the boat, but this is more or less kind of a passion project, along with Halo Infinite. The main reason why I wanted to cover this is because the HD version made some very significant changes to the game, making it far better than the Wii version that came out. And another reason I wanted to cover this is that Skyward Sword, up until The Phantom Hourglass, was probably my least favorite Zelda game that I played. So much so, I only ever played through it twice. Unlike every other game, aside from Phantom Hourglass, in the Zelda series that I played multiple times on multiple occasions. At one point, I was playing through all the Zelda games I had once a year. I kind of stopped doing that once Breath of the Wild launched because Breath of the Wild took a really long time to complete. Why did I dislike this game so much in comparison to the other Zelda games? Let's just get this out of the way. It's a bit cliche because I am a 30-something-year-old complaining about motion controls. But yes, that is the primary reason why I did not like this game. There are other issues, such as the art style, which I will talk about later. But yes, motion controls were just terrible. I'm not sure how they have fared to this day, but with the Wii, even with the Wii Motion Plus, they were not good. But I'm not going to go too detailed into it right now. So what I decided to do for this review is I actually got out my Wii U and I plugged in my copy of Skyward Sword and I played it with a Wii Motion Plus controller. I originally had an attachment for the bottom of a normal Wii controller without the built-in Motion Plus. This time I used a Wii Motion Plus controller just to sort of help eliminate any variables that the attachment wasn't as good as one built in, along with having a newer version of it probably working better. Now, I didn't play the whole entire game from beginning to end on the Wii and then do the same thing for the HD version. That would just be insane and take a really long time. So what I did do is I started a completely new game and played through the first dungeon on both the HD version and the original versions to make a comparison. I did finish the game on the HD version though. I'm just going to get this out of the way. It's not exactly a fair comparison, especially because of the visuals. With that said, let's get started. So I played the Wii version first, and right away there's a huge noticeable difference between the two when you watch the initial cutscene. You can see this weird sort of blurry edge around the Wii version. You don't see that in the HD version whatsoever. I'm pretty sure this is due to hardware limitations, but it's just one of the aspects that makes the HD version a far superior version of the same game. Out of curiosity, I did put the game through Dolphin and mess with the settings to see if I could clean up that edge. I got some mixed results with that. I did clean up the edge, but it didn't quite render it correctly. There was sort of like a weird triple image effect. Unlike what I did with GameCube games, which definitely cleared up the game and made it a lot smoother with a GameCube game. That's a bit of a tangent I went on, but I just wanted to share that. I want to try avoiding the story as much as I can, because every time I do, I turn a video that's intended to be maybe 30 minutes long into something that's an hour and 30 minutes long. So this is as close as I'm going to get to it, though. It starts out with Link, which has become a tradition of him waking up. So this is where you gain control of Link, and there is definitely a distinct difference between using a Wiimote, Pro Controller, and Joy-Cons. So I will say in terms of a superiority that the Joy-Cons and the Wiimote have over the Pro Controllers is getting the camera to face behind Link. But that's only maybe one or two things that I might say are actually slightly better than actually using a Pro Controller in this case. And this is mainly due to the sword being relegated to the right analog stick on the Pro Controller. Now, in terms of controlling Link's movement, other than the camera, there's not that much difference between the two. It's still smooth, and it works well. Now, when I was playing through the two different versions, I more or less tried my best to duplicate each action from the Wii version into the HD version to sort of get a definite feel for any differences I might get. So I started right off the bat helping Fledge, and this is where one of the very noticeable differences they made in the game, and that's to allow you to plow through conversations that you just don't care about in any shape or form, which is a huge difference, and it definitely reflects in my recording time, mainly because I didn't want to go through the conversations again in the HD version, but two, most of the time you can just skip through it and not miss anything. Between the two playthroughs I did for this review, I sort of more or less just followed the same path, which I stated before. There is one difference that I sort of noticed right off the bat, and that's when you exited the academy and you talked to Instructor Hornwell, who asked you to go rescue Mia off the top of the roof. This difference resulted when you have to push the box against the side of the academy to get up there. In the Wii version, it sort of required some interpretation on the controller's part in order for Link to climb up on that box. For whatever reason, when I did it, unless I was holding the A button to sprint up the box, he would just try and push the box, versus the HD version where he actually would climb the box without having to hit the sprint button. It's just a minor difference, but it was one that I noticed right off the bat, so I felt like it should have been included. So this brings me to where you meet up with Zelda at the temple. And this is part of the reason why I felt like I didn't like this game, and probably other people, is that the visuals are a little bit on the goofy side, is the best or nicest way I can put it. There's something off with all the characters' appearances in general. And when you see Zelda, you're like, there's something not quite right with her face. Her mouth is a little too wide, her neck a little too long, and she looks a little on the stringy side. But that's not just Zelda, it's a lot of the characters in this game. It's like their mouths were animated in a weird way, and I don't know why they did it. So after you find out that Link's bird is missing, and Zelda rescues Link after attempting to accidentally murder him, you head into the town proper. And again, this is where the art style comes into play, and part of the reason why I think this game may have received a negative outlook in terms of its visuals. At least it did for me. And it starts with the kid that's asking you to roll into a tree. This kid is just the most hideous character in the game. I don't know why they animated him like this. It's kind of cruel, and it's extremely abnormal in either version. And the chosen art style continues throughout the whole entire game. It doesn't get as bad as this kid for the rest of the game, but it's up there. And it seems every character, including Link himself, does not escape this to some degree. Some get it worse than others. Which then brings me to Groose. He isn't as bad as his cronies Colin and Stitch, which they also kind of got the treatment of being animated in a terrible fashion, making the trip down the Uncanny Valley a horrible nightmare. On top of that, the music that accompanies this character, for the most part, whenever you see him, is just atrocious. Sure, it conveys the attitude that you should sort of have, or what they want you to have, in regards to Groose and his cronies. It just doesn't sound good at all in any shape or form. And it feels like it's just a poor substitution for the lack of voice acting in the game. In this case, I think maybe they should have introduced voice acting a little sooner. That way they wouldn't have had to use music in order to convey the emotions that should be conveyed with these characters. And another thing for me personally that I had a problem with this game overall is that this whole entire island is supposed to be the sort of central area where the Hylians fled to. Except the problem I have with it is the scale of the island. It's tiny. It's extremely tiny. And there's only a handful of people on the island. I think there's actually more people in the Ocarina of Time than there are on this island. And the sky is sort of treated as a semi-archipelago of sorts, but not to a scale that it feels like it should be sustaining a whole entire civilization of people who at one point will come down to the surface and start a whole new entire kingdom. If I were going to make a change, I would have made this island maybe the whole entire academy, and then maybe put something off in the distance to represent a whole entire city, and maybe a little bit of rural countryside with farms and stuff like that. They sort of did that with the lumpy pumpkin inn, but yet again, the scale is really, really small. And that's not my only gripe. I'll cover a little bit more once we get down to the surface, but I want to get back to the controls. So after finding out that you need to get into the cave system below the waterfall in order to rescue Link's bird, I go to the training hall and get the sword. And this is my first experience with the different control styles. Now, the Joy-Cons are more or less comparable to the Wiimote, while the controller is not. It's a completely different feel to the game. The controller using the analog stick is just by far more reliable than the Joy-Cons and the Wiimote. So why they didn't have an option for an analog stick to begin with is beyond me. They already had an example of a game that had a similar control style back on the PlayStation, that being Ape Escape, and it worked. I can't emphasize enough how much better the analog stick is compared to the Joy-Cons or even the Wii Remote. There's no room for interpretation, or actually very little, if any. I think the only exception I've ever had any issue is when I was chopping down the bamboo out in the bamboo grove, in which I was moving the analog stick faster than the game could keep up, and it sort of did mess up a little bit on my back and forth motion. Outside of the bamboo grove, the controls are responsive. When I want to make a horizontal strike right to left, I push right, it does it. Same for the opposite direction. If I want to make a slash downward, I do it. If I want to make a slash upward, I push up and it does it. If I want to stab, I just push down on the joystick and it works. With that said, the analog controls just made the game a much more pleasant experience. But now let me cover the Joy-Con versus the Wiimote. So the Wiimote, yes, the technology was much newer and a lot older. On top of that, I'm not sure if the age of my controller might interfere with the input it detects. I'm not entirely sure, and being able to rule that out would be very difficult since all of my systems are old and used at this point. So when I played with the Joy-Cons, they were definitely more accurate, but the motions had to be much more deliberate and much slower in comparison to the Wiimote. But that's an advantage on the Wiimote in some cases, which I'll cover later. I still had similar issues between the two with them recognizing certain motions though. Particularly stabbing is the one that both had the hardest issues recognizing. I didn't mention it, but raising your shield to block with the controller is also better, requiring no motion other than a push down on the other analog stick to get it to work, versus both the Joy-Con and the Wiimote, which requires a motion to activate, and it doesn't necessarily always recognize that motion. Now I want to go over flying in the game with all three control schemes. Again, the analog sticks prove far superior, being a lot more reliable in terms of its input versus the motion controls of the Joy-Cons and the Wiimote. Now, this is an area where the Wiimote was actually better than the Joy-Con. Like I said, it's a lot more sensitive than the Joy-Cons, but the Joy-Cons are more accurate. And just for clarification on that last part, I mean more accurate in detecting what motion you're trying to make. But due to the deliberate nature of the Joy-Cons, this is why the Wiimote's a lot better for flying and steering the bird, because it responds a lot better with far less exaggerated motion than with the Joy-Cons. And the same thing happens when you're doing anything that requires Link to balance, let's say, on a tightrope. I know it's a bit of a tangent, but in this case, I had to over-exaggerate the direction I wanted Link to go with the Joy-Con versus the Wiimote. And most of the time I couldn't even pull it off compared to what I did with the Wiimote. But the negative part about the Wiimote in terms of flying is that it kind of has to be held in a weird, awkward way that you would normally not even handle the Wiimote to begin with. After winning the contest, which also doesn't make any sense, you think they'd be more of a test, but they did a contest, which now makes it so only one person gets to graduate and become a knight. which they're responsible for keeping people from falling off the island in case their bird doesn't show up. So why would they only allow one person to graduate? So then they continue on with the ceremony where Link goes to the top of the goddess statue with Zelda, and Zelda then tries to murder Link for the second time in the game. But luckily, Link's sailcloth actually saves him. Link and Zelda fly off in celebration, and Zelda gets pulled down to the surface by a black tornado. All this leads to Link waking up in the middle of the night, in which he goes out of his dorm room because he hears a voice, and he meets Fi. Now, I can't speak for everyone, but I know I can speak for a good section of people. Fi, probably the worst Zelda sidekick ever. Fi is basically a living mannequin as far as I'm concerned, with some poorly written dialogue. I can't say for any other language, but in terms of English, it's not good. It's like somebody wrote how they thought a robot would actually speak. There have been instances of AI that have exuded normal human behavior and personalities versus Fi. And personally, I think they missed a huge opportunity to maybe do a bit of script doctoring and give her some better dialogue along with a personality. Don't get me wrong, the ability to skip cutscenes and fast forward through conversations is nice, but when it comes to Fi, I feel like there should have been some improvements made to the character overall. So Fi leads Link on a sort of chase, or actually she's trying to get him to follow, and only to get him to a back passage to the temple instead of just going through the front door. I'm not sure why they just didn't do that. It seems like a weird offshoot for the whole entire story and game, because you never visit that place ever again. The only real reason I can say is that, one, they show that they're monsters out at night, and two, the cat-like thing that Link rescued off the building, aka Mia, I'm pretty sure this is a different one because there's multiple of the same animal throughout the village, become hostile, which they could have done by putting any of them along the path to the temple. And to sort of emphasize this point, the headmaster walks in on Link when you get into the temple and he sees Fi. Just to reiterate, I said he probably should have just walked through the front door. This whole back passage made zero sense. And again, this is another part where the HD remake shines with the ability to skip through cutscenes and conversations. Like I said, Fi's dialogue is not that great. I mean, there's one line I sort of liked in it, but that was it. The next part I find a little on the cringe side, just a touch. And that's how Link gets his signature tunic and color. And that's because the graduating class, which there was only one person yet again, got to have that color. I mean, every other member of the academy that has graduated has their own color, but the same outfit. It kind of reminded me a little bit of the Han Solo movie with all those stupid little moments with Han, especially when they did his last name. Now on both playthroughs, I went and just bought a shield. And then I went to Faron Woods. We're skipping the flying part I already covered. When you enter the initial part of Faron Woods, you encounter Deku Baba. And here they introduce mechanics for what direction to swing your sword, indicated by the opening in their mouths. It's kind of neat because it's an easy way to show mechanics that are going to be used throughout the game, and easing you into the actual combat. One thing I did want to touch on is that when you enter this initial part of Faron Woods, you'll see what's basically a corkscrew sort of crater in the ground. Get used to this. You'll see this a lot. So a bit of a cliche when it comes to this game is complaining about the boss that you will fight multiple times in this area. But it is a problem. It's not particularly fun, but they keep repeating it. So with that repetition in mind, I'm not entirely sure why they didn't learn their lesson from the Phantom Hourglass. This isn't the only area in the game. They constantly reuse the same areas over and over again, making the game feel extremely small. After strengthening the seal in the bottom of the crater that keeps the imprisoned sealed away, you go into the temple. And here you meet an old woman with a really long piece of hair tied around in a sort of circular bun. You talk to her, and then you proceed through a second set of doors where you encounter your first group of bokoblins. And remember when I said that every character in this game sort of suffers from the weird animation style that they chose? The bokoblins also were kind of done dirty. They look goofy and unthreatening. They're very cartoonish, and I don't know why they went with this design choice. Now, in terms of actual combat with them, it varies from the control style. On the Wii version, there is actually sort of a slight advantage to it due to that whole oversensitivity and it not detecting or even interpreting the direction correctly. And I suspect, which I'm pretty sure I'm right, that the AI will take inputs that the player makes, feeds it to the bokoblins, whatever you're fighting, so that they'll maneuver their swords or weapons or whatever to block your sword strikes. It's extremely noticeable in the HD version, where you're supposed to sort of lead them and try and trick them into blocking a different direction, but you really can't do that because it's constantly reading the direction that you're pushing the analog stick in, versus the Wiimote, which sometimes or often cannot properly detect what direction you're actually swinging sometimes. And that's where the advantage of the Wii version comes from. It's not much of one. They still block constantly. It's just you get lucky and it interprets the motion wrong and you get a lucky strike in. This is where the Joy-Cons actually are a bit worse. Mainly because you have to be very slow and deliberate with the Joy-Cons versus the analog stick or even the Wii remote. So here's another design choice I sort of have an issue with because they now show that there are Gorons available. And that this particular Goron decides to bother you about save locations, which they already covered back in the village in the sky. I mean, the only difference is you can now return to the sky using the save station. I don't know why they needed to go on a diatribe with this one Goron, but they did. And another thing I'd like to mention is that the sky above was just a sheet of clouds up until they poked a hole in it. Yet it's extremely bright and sunny below this layer of clouds. And it's not just in Faron Woods, it's every part of the game that is below the clouds. I digress. Let's keep moving. So then they introduced the Kikwi, the sort of bird-like plant creatures who can somehow speak the same language as Link. Same for the Gorons, I might add. I mean, that's a bit of a nitpick. Who cares? It's for story elements that they just speak the same language, and it'd just be a giant pain in the butt to run around and find some way to force players to translate the language. But then they also introduced dowsing, which kind of seems to be another underused or pointless mechanic, since most of the time you only use it to find one thing at a time, where you have more than one option to track more than one thing are far and few. And the only other time I can really recall having to even select from anything else was the goddess cubes. And once you find all the goddess cubes, you're back down to one other item, and even then, it's none. So I'm not even sure why this mechanic was added. The various areas the game takes place in, and try and give off a sense of semi-open worldness, but they're extremely linear in nature. The other areas of the game aren't as bad, but Faron Woods is by far the worst. And this is mainly due to the sheer number of times you have to come back to this forest. You even have to come back to the temple a second time later in the game. Which sort of brings up to mind that the areas are actually kind of empty for being so small as well. Like when you first enter the part of the Faron Woods, there are no enemies until you get to the clearing where you meet your first Kikwi. And even then, it's just 2 Deku Babas. Actually 3, but whatever. It's not much of a threat, and there's really not much going on here in this area. And further into the woods, you'll only find a spot with 3 Bokoblins, another one with just 1 Bokoblin, and maybe 1 or 2 Deku Baba dotting the place. I mean, it's extremely empty for such a small map. I'll reiterate that. They do have crows, but they're not that many of them, and they only occur in one spot in the game, and that's near a temple-ish structure in Faron Woods. After tracking all the lost Kikui down, you're given a slingshot. I will admit that it's a lot easier to aim with the Wiimote versus the analog stick or even the Joy-Cons. And this is due to the nature of its point and shoot mechanics that are very prevalent with Wii games, but it's not that much of an advantage. Yes, it's a bit faster and a little bit more accurate. You still have to deal with shaky hands, which can vary from person to person, so your mileage is going to vary. Also do a bit of a callback to the point where I talked about the tightrope, which I already mentioned that yes, the Wiimote is actually better than the Joy-Cons. Like I keep saying, the Joy-Cons require more deliberate, slower movements, in which case they're also not as sensitive, so they can't register that same amount of movement compared to the Wiimote. Or that's just my experience of it. It could be different from others, but from what I experienced, the Joy-Cons aren't as good. Now there are mechanics for swinging on vines, which the analog stick did prove to be the far superior control option, compared to both the Wiimote and the Joy-Con controllers. When you go deeper into Pharaoh Woods, you find the temple, and you find the Gorn again, who interrupts you to point out the goddess cubes. The ability to skip through dialogue is just the best thing that could have happened to this game. Maybe not the best thing, but one of the best things. So here is another example of Fi's terrible dialogue. I mean, it's been happening throughout the game as you've been going through the woods, and she constantly annoys you in the Wii version, but they allowed you to skip that or ignore her altogether in the HD version. But here she starts calculating probabilities, which I'm not entirely sure how she does. And it comes off as out of place, kind of weird, especially for the game. Like I said, they wanted to steer the Legend of Zelda series into a more technological sort of area. So I'm guessing that's where this dialogue comes from, but they just did a really terrible job with it. And I'll state it again, if anyone who can speak Japanese or anyone who is Japanese and played the Japanese version and can translate for us, or me in particular, how does it sound to you in terms of its dialogue? I just want to know. When you get into the dungeon, there's nothing that's different. They kept the layout and the puzzles the same. The only thing that's different are the control options depending on what you choose. And I've already covered those. Now let's fast forward to when you get Link's second piece of equipment, the Beetle. This is another area in which the analog stick has proven to be far superior to either the Joy-Cons or the Wii Remote. The Wii Remote's sort of finicky nature, and yet again you have to hold it at a weird angle to sort of get it to respawn, and the Joy-Cons require that very slow, deliberate motion with very exaggerated movements sometimes to get it to detect the motion that you want, make the analog far better and far more responsive than either of the motion control options. I will say one thing about the Beetle, I don't particularly like it. Yes, it's supposed to be a replacement for the Boomerang, but it feels forced, like they were hooked on this idea of using motion controls, and this is the only way they can sort of force it on you, or at least that's what it feels like, is that they're forcing it on you instead of, just adding a Boomerang. I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate after that last statement, particularly because The Legend of Zelda has had a Boomerang in pretty much every version of the game up to this point, and the Beetle is an attempt to change that up. Same for other weapons in the game. But an easy counterpoint to that would be that they kept the bow and the claw shot, which pretty much control the exact same way as the Wii version of the Twilight Princess. Now let's move on to the part of the game where you get the key and you have to rotate it to match it up with the slot in the door. I had a much easier time with the analog stick versus the Wiimote or even the Joy-Con controllers. The Joy-Cons were actually better than the Wiimote in this instance, but the analog sticks were far superior. It seems like a little thing to go over, but the puzzles were solved a lot faster versus the Wiimote, which kept sort of twitching around due to the sensitivity of the motion controls. And once you open this door and you go to the other side, you fight your first boss of the game, Girahim. Now the fight with Girahim suffers from similar problems that you do with the Bokoblins, and that he always seems to be able to block or grab Link's sword when you swing. This is where the Wii version had a slight advantage. Yet again, I've already mentioned that because of its lack of ability to properly detect the motion, it will sometimes register the wrong motion and you'll land a hit in because of it. This can also be a bit of a disadvantage due to it registering the wrong motion, and you can accidentally swing your sword in the wrong direction, which can negatively affect you when you're trying to fight certain enemies that require you to swing your sword in a specific direction, particularly with Girahim when he pulls out his own sword. Now, I already told you my suspicion that the game takes the player's input and feeds it to the AI so that it can block the player's incoming attacks. You're supposed to sort of try and fake them out, which you really can't do with the analog stick, the way it works. It was built around having the motion controls, but even then they sort of don't work. The only reason why it really ever worked for me was yet again that sort of loose interpretation that you get from the Wiimote. And I know I keep saying interpretation, but I'm not really sure how else to put it other than really bad detection. But then again, it still detects some form of motion. It just does the wrong motion that you did. But I found with the analog stick having more precise control, especially in the later half of the fight, was to the distinct advantage of the player versus when the Wiimote or even the Joy-Cons were used. Mainly because, like I said, the Joy-Cons required a bit of a slow, deliberate movement, while the Wiimote sometimes might not register the right swipe that you made. I will say that Girahim only suffers a little bit from the animation style that they have applied to the game. He is a bit eccentric, which seems to be sort of a trope in Japanese storytelling, especially in anime, at least that's what I think. And it seems all around that the bosses had much more effort put into them versus the regular monsters or NPCs you'll interact with. I will say that this fight isn't too hard, and it was kind of on the fun side. It did seem to sort of drag out a little too much, particularly at the first part, especially if you seem to unable to land hits, which I've had sort of mixed results with both the analog Wiimote and the Joy-Con controllers in terms of him grabbing the blade and taking it from him. Or I should say taking it from Link. And after beating Girahim, you go into the next part of the temple, which is a pristine sort of fountain area. And you get the next stone, which unlocks Elden Volcano. One thing I didn't go over, but I'll go over now, is the use of the Loftwing Amiibo for the Nintendo Switch. This is a very distinct advantage versus the Wii version, considering you can go all the way back up to Skyloft from a temple, get what you need, use the Amiibo again, and go back to exactly where you left off versus, let's say, the Wii version where you had to go out of the dungeon, get to a save station that allowed you to go back into the sky in order to get to Skyloft. So that basically covers my more or less version versus version versus version of Skyward Sword, Wii version, HD version, with a comparison between the three controller types. Yes, the analog controller has proven to be far superior overall, with the ability to detect motion far more accurately and far faster than either the Joy-Cons or the Wiimote. There are some minor and occasional bits where the Wiimote was better than the Joy-Cons, and in some cases even the analog stick. Like I said, when it comes to fights where they were blocking the attacks, sometimes just getting a random attack in because the Wiimote detected motion and just did the wrong motion altogether, landing a lucky attack as an example. But something I did not mention that I meant to mention throughout is that I constantly had to recalibrate it all the time. Going into the menu, telling it to recalibrate, laying it down on the floor just so it could recalibrate, which was really particularly bad when it came to intensive combat where I was swinging the sword around a lot, especially in the fight with Girahim where I'd have to stop, recalibrate, and then go back to it. This is where the Joy-Cons actually had a better sort of experience for me, and that's when I could just point at the screen and hit a button and it recalibrate right then and there. No problem. But then again, I didn't even have to do that with the analog stick. I will say this would be my third time playing it, technically fourth, maybe even a fifth if you count them as each different playthroughs, because the first time I played the HD version, I did nothing but the analog stick, and I found myself enjoying the game much more, regardless of the negative aspects I have with the level design and the character design. I think I'll do a part 2 and maybe a part 3. I have a tendency to go into way too much detail for my own good, thus making the videos longer, but I wanted to cover the rest of the game. But it's going to be from the point of view of using the analog stick and maybe from memory of when I actually played using the Wiimote. So if you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.